Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, to pass this legislation swiftly, as all stakeholders' constituents have requested, so that the vacuum of uncertainty would be lifted on our trade relations with the U.S., our official opposition made many suggestions as to ways we would gladly cooperate with the government. Knowing that the federal election was coming up in October, Conservatives offered to begin a pre-study on the original legislation, Bill C-100, in May of this year. That way they would only have to deal with clause by clause later on. But the government declined. When the revised agreement was signed in December, Conservatives offered to come back early from Christmas break to begin work on the bill. Again, the government declined. A unanimous motion was passed. The International Trade Committee had approximately 200 requests come in on CUSMA. And the amount of work to do on the legislation hasn't changed. And we consistently offered to commence that work earlier, but the government declined. Conservatives ultimately offered to complete clause-by-clause examination by no later than March 5th, under the assumption that the government would not be recalling the House of Commons during the constituency break. Again, Madam Speaker, the government declined. A unanimous motion was passed at the International Trade Committee requesting that this government release its economic impact analysis for CUSMA. It was not provided until one day before committee conducted its clause-by-clause review, and the government's economic impact report compared CUSMA to not having a NAFTA deal at all. What this says is that the government wanted Canadians to believe that actually any trade deal, no matter how unbalanced or restrictive, would actually be better than nothing at all. Thankfully, the C.D. Howe Institute released a report comparing CUSMA to the old NAFTA deal on February 21st. It affirmed that CUSMA will reduce Canada's GDP by $14.2 billion. Canada's exports to the U.S. will fall by $3.2 billion, while our imports from the U.S. will increase by $8.6 billion. The C.D. Howe Institute's report sheds some light on why the government said it was important to support the new agreement moving quickly and then balked at every opportunity we gave to expedite the passing of this legislation. And so, Madam Speaker, we're here now dealing with the issues around what was not good in the agreement. And with those 200 organizations and individuals who wanted to come and talk to the committee, we were able to process through 100 of those. The Canadian manufacturers and exporters said, and I quote, "If we want Canada to take full advantage of this agreement, the government must take steps to ensure Canadian manufacturers' productivity levels are equivalent to that of other OECD countries, so they can succeed on North American markets and globally." Canadian Chamber of Commerce said the CUSMA, as signed last autumn, was an imperfect but necessary agreement to provide greater predictability in our relationships with Canada's largest trading partner. Predictability was lost to such an extent that we were to the point where people were saying, we need to just get this done. Last week, I met with my own Chamber of Commerce and also held a town hall with the Shadow Minister of Agriculture in my riding with a number of farmers from the area. Agriculture and agri-food producers, manufacturers, exporters, and all the support services of small businesses in my riding are experiencing the serious impacts of uncertainty that this government has plagued our economy with. Increased costs and loss of customer base because of the punitive policies of this government, and the uncertainty of our relationship with our biggest trading partner. Plus, the shutting down of supply routes due to strikes, due to lack of rail cars because oil is flowing on our tracks instead of safely through our pipelines, barricades that created dangerous situations and prevented their products from being shipped, carbon taxes on heating and cooling systems that are necessary for their manufacturing, increased payroll taxes, increased red tape. They feel they've been attacked and ignored by this government. They know that CUSMA is an imperfect but necessary agreement to provide better predictability in our relationships with Canada's largest trading partner. And so we are here, Madam Speaker, ready to pass this bill, C4. The Aluminum Association of Canada said, as part of the ongoing collaboration between the Government of Canada and industry, we intend to initiate discussions with the government to encourage Mexico to implement a similar measure which would help limit the arrival of products that do not comply with the rules of the agreement between our three countries. Canada's aluminum industry is concerned by this government's failure to secure the same Made in North America provisions for aluminum as was given to steel. And Canada is North America's largest producer of aluminum. And while the 70% rule of origin included looks good on paper, in reality, the failure to include a smelted and poured definition, which is what the industry is asking of in Mexico, without that definition, it will leave the North American industry vulnerable to dumping from overseas, particularly through Mexico. As well, I have to say, Madam Speaker, that the government needs to report on the status of the $2 billion in tariffs that the revenue that they collected thus far, to ensure that it actually was used to support Canadian businesses impacted by those tariffs. I can tell you that the manufacturers in my communities were very discouraged by what they saw in this government's behavior when they were facing shutdowns. Their suggestion that they help them deal with giving their people more EI. They don't want more EI. They wanted to be able to keep those people working. As well, there's an urgency to develop a strategy to market Canadian aluminum to the greenest in the world, to help shore up our competitiveness in existing and emerging markets. This is part of what the Conservative plan was with our environmental plan, which looked at showcasing and bragging to the world about what Canada already does and how we could help to impact the global issues on climate change that impact so many other countries that aren't as clean as Canada is. And then there's our dairy farmers. Madam Speaker, the largest group left behind by this government during the negotiations is Canada's dairy sector. This government has managed to simultaneously shrink the opportunity for Canadian dairy producers and processors at home in Canada, while also limiting their ability to grow by exporting. Canada agreed to place a worldwide cap on exports of certain dairy products in CUSMA, which is unprecedented in regional trade agreements. As the nation's prosperity depends on reliable access to global markets in every market, but also specifically in dairy, Canada must not agree to this kind of provision in any future trade agreement. Why would this government say yes to giving the U.S. that kind of power over our sovereignty and our opportunity to trade as we wish with other countries? This concession, as I said, is an affront to our sovereignty, and there's no excuse or rational argument for this capitulation to go hat in hand to the U.S. to ask them if we can please have permission from them to export dairy to any country we choose to trade with. Madam Speaker, there are so many areas that are faulty in this particular agreement that the stakeholders brought to the attention of the committee, and we were able to create recommendations for this government to move forward and to rectify a lot of those issues that are there. In government procurement, we have no chapter on being able to secure Canada's access to the U.S. market. In auto, Canada's exports of motor vehicles to the U.S. will decline by $1.5 billion relative to the current trade regime under NAFTA, and imports would decrease by $1.2 billion. In light of the hardships faced by Ontario's auto sector, compounded by the punitive actions of this government against our competitiveness, they must fulfill the auto sector's request to delay the implementation of CUSMA for the auto sector until January 2021, as per the industry's request, to allow them to adjust to the new climate of the deal. And then there's forestry, Madam Speaker. So many mills have closed, and support services, small businesses, whole communities have been brought to a standstill by this government's indifference. They don't deserve this attitude from their Prime Minister, who they expect to re-engage right now with the United States Trade Representative to find a solution to this issue. Cultural exemption. The price for protecting the cultural exemption within CUSMA was to open ourselves up to retaliatory tariffs not limited to that sector. For example, if Canada decides to implement a digital service tax for companies such as Netflix, the United States would be within its right, as per CUSMA, to place a tariff of equal commercial effect on any Canadian export. Madam Speaker, these are just a few of the examples of where this government has capitulated to the U.S. Their reply to the whole document is a huge document of all of their successes. Ours, from what I understand, what our previous Minister of Trade on this side of the House said was 72 pages long. Clearly, Canada has not come out in the best circumstances here, but as the stakeholders said, we just need to get this done and move on, hopefully in the future with better arrangements. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I have a difficult time with the Conservative Party's approach to the whole issue of trade. On the bill itself, they say that they're going to support, and then they will go absolutely all over the place in terms of why it is that it's such a bad trade deal. You know, it's almost as if you follow the logic, you would think that they would be voting against the trade agreement in which they've been speaking of. And it really takes some exception, you know, when they try to come across as if they're the protectors of supply management. You know, this is from the Conservative Party, the same party that destroyed the Canadian Wheat Board in terms of the actions that it had taken. And prior to that, they said that they would do nothing to hurt the Canadian Wheat Board. And once they were in government, if the Conservatives were in government today, they wouldn't have protected the supply management, Madam Speaker. Many people, many farmers would recognize that fact. My question to the member opposite is, what gives her, what in her opinion gives her party credibility when they are so inconsistent on this particular trade agreement?
Honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The inconsistency is on that side of the House. They voted against the very first NAFTA agreement. We are the party of free trade. The other trade agreements that they were championing today that they signed their name on, all of that work was done by this party when we were on that side of the House. You have nothing to say to me about free trade, sir, through the Speaker. We are very proud of the fact that we do very good deals. It is unfortunate, quite honestly, from my perspective, that we do have to vote in favor of this in light of these issues, but it has been done so poorly, and all of our stakeholders are saying we need this to be dealt with, and we'll move on from here. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable member for Hamilton Mountain.
Thank my colleague for her speech. One of the things I think it's important, when the first NAFTA agreement came out, under the Conservatives, 400,000 jobs were lost. I know in the city of Hamilton, we had many jobs that we lost through manufacturing, and the city was collapsing. However, we have investor state provisions that were negotiated that were allowed investors to sue our country under the first agreement. Now that this is taken away under this agreement, does she not feel, through you, Madam Speaker, I'd like to ask the question, does she not feel that it's a better agreement now than it was in the first original agreement?
Honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
From what I see of the feedback from the stakeholders in the auto industry, there's a lot of angst around issues with this particular agreement, which is why they've requested that it not be implemented for the auto industry until 2021.
Questions and comments. The Honourable member for Sandwich School Violence.
Thank you, and I thank my honourable friend from Yorkton Melville for her speech. Of course, it's always difficult to look back, and I know that people tend to forget what happened in the 41st Parliament. But the passage of the Canada-China Investment Treaty is one that we really need to focus on. People forget that it exists. I've heard so many members speak to the issues we have in CUSMA now that we've gotten rid of Chapter 11, that was the investor state provisions that allowed the U.S. government to sue us in secret. But it was under Stephen Harper that we're now obligated for decades for secret tribunals that the People's Republic of China's state-owned enterprises have the right to lien on the Canadian government in secret, first for 6 months, and then bring secret arbitration cases if we do anything that hurts the expectation of profits of corporations from the People's Republic of China. So I asked my friend from Yorkton Melville if she'd be willing to look into the implications of that, which was passed in secret in Cabinet without a vote in Parliament.
Honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
Thank you for the question. I can't answer that. But what I would say is I would ensure that if we were forming government, we would be far more careful about the way we encourage investment of China in this country going forward.
One last question. The Honourable member for Edmonton West.
Wagantall for her speech. She mentioned the delays of the Liberal government in allowing Parliament and the opposition parties to study the bill. We asked in October, December. Just wondering if she could explain why she thinks the Liberal Party continually blocks Parliament from proper oversight of such an important deal.
For Yorkton Melville, very short answer.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yeah, clearly there's a problem on the other side of the floor. Quite often we see them make announcements and then they try to figure out how to implement those. And I think in this case, this deal took so long and was poorly debated, poorly constructed, and then realizing that they had conceded so much that they were trying to avoid any kind of scrutiny and just simply get it through the House.